Today, we're diving into one of the 20th century's absolute darkest chapters. Using records from the Documentation Center of Cambodia, we're going to explore just how the Khmer Rouge came to power and unleash their radical, violent vision of Year Zero on an entire nation. It all began on April 17, 1975. Black-clad soldiers marched into Cambodia's capital, Phnom Penh, ending a brutal 5-year civil war. For the people celebrating in the streets, it felt like peace had finally arrived. But what they didn't know was that a new, almost unimaginable horror was just beginning.
So, to really get what happened next, we have to ask a fundamental question. Who exactly were these soldiers? And who were the mysterious leaders of this movement that we call the Khmer Rouge?
Well, the secrecy of the regime was just absolute. The world knew them as the Khmer Rouge, which just means Red Khmer, but that was really just a generic label. The real power, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, operated so deep in the shadows that its very existence was a mystery, even to most of the Cambodians living under its rule. Think about that. And this secrecy, it wasn't just a tactic, it was fundamental to their entire ideology. The state operated under this faceless, all-powerful name, Angkar Polvedat, which simply translates to the Revolutionary Organization. Angkar was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, a constant, invisible authority controlling every single thing. Now, the party's roots, they stretched back for decades, changing names and affiliations along the way. But the real turning point, the critical moment, came in 1963. That's when Saloth Sar, the man the world would later know as Pol Pot, took control. He began steering the party away from Vietnamese influence and pulling it much closer to the radical agrarian ideology of Maoist China. And their growth was just explosive. They were fueled by the chaos of the Civil War and, importantly, a massive U.S. bombing campaign that completely devastated the countryside. The Khmer Rouge used this to rapidly expand their influence. I mean, look at this. In just 1 year, they went from controlling these small pockets of the country to dominating almost all of it. So by April 1975, with the American-backed government totally collapsing, the Khmer Rouge were right at the gates of the capital. And the city's first reaction? It was just overwhelming relief. People flooded the streets, they were waving white flags, celebrating what they thought was the end of years and years of war and suffering. But that celebration? It was tragically short-lived. For the leaders of the old government who stayed behind, people like Prince Surik Matok, their fate was grim. His final, haunting words to the U.S. ambassador really capture that sense of abandonment. Within days, he and hundreds of other officials were rounded up and executed. You see, the Khmer Rouge had this radical, utopian vision for Cambodia. It wasn't just a new government. It was a plan for a complete and total reset of society. And they wasted absolutely no time putting it into action. They called it Year Zero, and they meant that literally. This was an ideology that saw cities, money, religion, and education as sources of corruption. To build their perfect society, they believed that every single pillar of the old world had to be smashed to bits: religion, property, even the family itself. All that would be left was a pure, classless, agrarian state. And the very first step in this plan was the immediate, brutal evacuation of all cities. Just try to imagine that. 2 million people, the entire population of Phnom Penh, including over 1 million refugees, forced from their homes at gunpoint and marched out into the complete unknown. And how did they get everyone to leave? Well, they lied. As this cyclo driver remembers, they were told the Americans were about to bomb the city and that they could just come back in a few days. It was a complete fabrication, designed to stop any resistance before it could start. And here's the truly horrific part. There were no exceptions. None. Hospitals were emptied of their patients. The very old, the very young, the sick, the pregnant, everyone was forced onto the roads. And as this heartbreaking testimony from Soray shows, thousands died along the way from exhaustion, starvation, or were simply taken away and killed. For those who actually survived that march, they discovered a terrifying new reality out in the countryside, a life completely controlled by the faceless Angkar. Angkar was meant to replace the family unit entirely. All loyalty, all affection was supposed to be directed to the state. Children were taught to spy on their own parents. Showing any personal feeling was basically a crime. Angkar became the only family anyone was allowed to have. The regime's propaganda, it painted this picture of a happy, productive society full of smiling peasants. But the reality was a nightmare. We're talking forced labor for over 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, often standing in waterlogged fields with barely any food. Starvation and exhaustion weren't just byproducts, they were tools of state control. Angkar claimed that only pure people, meaning uneducated rural peasants, could build their revolution. And this led to the systematic extermination of anyone they deemed an enemy. The categories were terrifyingly broad. Former government officials, intellectuals, ethnic minorities, even their own party members who were suspected of being traitors. Simply wearing glasses could be a death sentence. This reign of terror lasted for 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days. An absolute eternity for those who had to live through it. So how did it end? It wasn't from a rebellion inside the country, but from an invasion from the outside. After a series of border clashes, Vietnam invaded. And the fall of the Khmer Rouge revealed to the entire world a national tragedy on a scale that was just almost incomprehensible. The human cost was simply staggering. Nearly 2 million people perished. To put that into perspective, that's a quarter of the country's entire population wiped out in less than 4 years by starvation, exhaustion, disease, or just outright execution. And make no mistake, this was not random violence, it was systematic. Research since 1979 has uncovered this vast, nationwide infrastructure the regime built for imprisonment, torture, and mass murder. Almost 200 prisons, over 19,000 mass graves. The killing fields were not confined to one isolated place. This map says it all. The entire country became a prison, scarred by the regime's violence. Every single province was touched by this tragedy. The history of democratic Kampuchea forces all of us to confront this profound and incredibly difficult question. Understanding not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen, remains a vital and urgent lesson for all of humanity.